Hello everyone, today we talk about a delicate aspect of the Roman early colonization within our look at the conquest of Italy, specifically in archaic times, let's say from the 5th to the early 3rd century BC. You know, last winter I touched a bit on this topic. We began to observe some things in depth, the relation between Rome and the Allies, the pace of Roman conquest, the general profile of Romano-Italic warfare at this point, and the molding of what would become, in fact, the power of the Second Punic War that would, with that, a conflict essentially take off in all the rest of the Mediterranean and beyond. Now, as it often happened in Roman history, not just, as we will see today, because of a bit of the readaptation of some concepts in the key of mostly where we get most of the historiography, the Roman historiography from in the 1st century BC. Lots of events kind of repeated with a certain pattern in Roman history that naturally in the aspect of conquest, of colonization, and the maintenance of the backbone of the Roman military were always quite crucial and at different times in Roman history. So as we've seen in the previous videos, the Roman archaic warfare stemmed from an essentially feudal base. Right, in the 5th century, Rome was monopolized by the major patrician clans that still wanted to keep basically the whole cake for themselves, because they were truly, again, feudal warriors, massive landowners that had their own clienteles, had, of course, a control on the plebs, but that, given the position of Rome and her great, in fact, strategic, economic, political value in Latium, could not last for long without the integration of the plebs in the army and the effective conferment of what in fact had not really been the case before from a nobiliary perspective, the imperium to the same, to some exponents of the plebs. Naturally, the plebs is not to be understood just like everyone, right? The plebs was in turn essentially represented by very rich and powerful individuals that could in fact be co-opted by the same Roman elite. Today we will, in a sense, understand this from the laws of the legislation on debt. Right, you say, but this is not about war. It is actually about warfare for the simple reason that there is yet another perspective on which to look at the literal takeoff of Roman military power that we have seen in the videos about properly the stages of the Roman conquest of the peninsula and colonization and the relation with land, right? People and land in this case, and what kind of wealth they owned fundamentally as Romans, right? So a notion that not even today we will basically analyze in depth, because you know that in this sense, senatus populusque, there's a huge debate historiographically on what a Roman really meant in terms of this ultra-aristocratic and nobiliary power, and in fact the plebs and the essentially the conferment, as we've seen, of property of sacral nobility through the kingdom militaris, right? So the fact that if you were considered a miles as a freedman, essentially you were essentially a nobleman yourself. This is something that really was deeply understood throughout all the ancient world, also for most of the Middle Ages, actually, especially in areas like in this case, which among the Latins, wealth was, in spite of these social differences, fairly well distributed. We will see that actually the regulations on, for example, the limits of people and cattle could be owned on a given part of the ager publicus suggest ridiculous numbers compared to the ones that the Roman aristocracy would reach in even quickly right after this time, right? It was immense in many ways, but let's remember this still with a sound bulk of I could say middle class wealth, right? Consider that Italy remained the richest country in the world per capita uninterruptedly from Roman times to the late 17th century. So in spite of all what you can't claim about the antiquity, the crisis, the early Middle Ages, whatever, the actual face of these people was quite strongly, and we've seen it also in some videos, in fact, about early medieval peasantry, and practically the fact that, the Italian countryside would witness this shift from the late Roman colonists to free massari, essentially, that something that does not happen actually in the rest of Europe, where people mostly becomes the equivalent of some sort of serfs. At least they're very strongly subjected. Naturally, the thing is very nuanced for a great deal of reasons. Today we don't talk about medieval history, but it's important to connect this to properly the concept of power in archaic times, right? And also dimensioning in the sense Roman society and the Roman military for what they were at the core, right? It's needless to say that I think at this point in history things have taken such a radically subjectivistic and ideologistic way that people think whatever they want about a single reality and they pretend it to be true. So say there were social differences, so it was an unjust system. Conservatives reason in the same way like liberals do, not to say right-wingers in a leftistic way, and stressing my deep belief that nationalism and socialism overlap, and they're just the perfect step towards communism, because that's really the last stage. Instead, the objective of history is properly giving, in fact, a scientific dimension to this kind of relations. Because people really look at this system and say, my God, because we'll make a video actually about, for example, how many people Rome enslaved during the conquest, how actually this thing of the manumission also was deeply connected with that sense of defeat and redemption that made Rome essentially the most successful polity in the history of mankind. And so in ways that necessitate actually a religious history that today we cannot do, but we can look still very concretely at what this meant, right? And the struggle that had been occurring in Rome between, of course, the patricians and the plebeians, that is deeply connected with the issue of the army and land distribution, and thus colonization, thus the military service and juridical status, juridical and political status, as you understand. That is something that I personally looked at especially at communal realities in the late 13th, early 14th century, when you realize that the really big step ahead in the history of civilization at any point is when you pass from essentially a sort of provincial scale, tribal, seasonal warfare of some kind into something statal, regional in scale, and professional, right? That really is the divide between civilizations and barbarity by a significant degree. With pretty impacting political and military, of course, social consequences, meaning those who achieved that managed to take over basically everybody around them, and to their great credit, morally, civilizationally, culturally, and so on. So it's obvious that the history of Rome is also a history that highlights quite well the sharp contrast between an elite that is, however, intelligent enough to understand how to co-opt and how to make use properly of this actually dangerous plebeian forces, and the latter from the other side that understand the importance of authority, of hierarchy, of reason, right? And thus, both systems making work in the state, and not like essentially today's world where everybody's getting dumber, more stupid, and poorer, and fundamentally wants to collapse, make everything collapse in, together with them, except it will not happen. They just will be under somebody's, soul, and deservingly so, right? So if you want something, go and get it, right? And that's what was really very clear at the time in which Rome took over Italy, in this sense. So here we have to deal importantly with Roman historiography, and so looking at this time in history that notoriously is before the beginning of the 3rd century BC, is something between myth and history, which is not myth, is something, again, between myth and history, otherwise would just say myth, and that, in this sense, actually tells a lot, right? Because these information is told to us essentially from 1st century BC Roman senators who drew heavily from their written tradition, whichever it was, which we hardly know overall, and the sagas, to actually tell us something that anthropologically makes a huge deal of sense, right? But and also politically, historically, militarily, and again, what this is not the video to discuss this aspect specifically, but the point is that the more we realize what they were actually saying beyond a rationalistic kind of approach, which is just was it didn't really exist as such, at least so in such a commonly spread way until a couple of 100 years ago, especially when thinking history. We would actually read a pretty damn accurate history of early Rome that makes an extraordinary amount of sense. So the Romans of the late Republic, when these things were written down, essentially believed that they had already been planting colonies at the time in the Age of Kings, right? So the idea is that Rome had, in a sense, already been born with this thing ingrained of locating a certain amount of people somewhere, essentially for the function of military colonization, holding strategic positions, and the thing actually is quite likely in itself. I mean, there wouldn't be anything strange, if anything, because the thing works on a smaller scale. We were very well informed about all these traditions by, for example, the avampost that the single Roman feudal clans had in the countryside, with these massive landowners controlled, in fact, fortifications, also at the frontier with other people. So in many ways, it was a very private system, where we know that, think about the Fabii on the Crimea, literally, died, made their last stands really for their own same fortune in Rome. Naturally, we cannot accept even uncritically this information either. We must try really to understand what's really in between this. However, we can see that at least the most important, the most statally oriented time in which Rome started to create colonies as essentially, and this is crucial, not as a feudal clanic avampost of some sort with some settlement people living there, but as a Roman statal one. So the idea that something was Rome uniquely meant, right? This was already true since the beginning, but again, without the combination, without the conferment of the imperium to plebeian magistracies, this was dramatically limited just to the private assets of the feudal clans. And again, that seasonal kind of private provincial aristocratic dimension could not quite be really surpassed, nor power concentrated so effectively as it would start being at this point. And the thing overlaps chronologically with essentially the beginning of Roman expansion, unsurprisingly, right? And it's also not just a coincidence that it in fact overlaps with the period of alliance of Rome with the outer Latin League cities. So essentially between the Battle of Lake Regillus and the war of 338 that would put an end to the Latin League. We've seen these things in the past. We'll come back on them at some point. So this phase is, as we've seen, one of cooperation between Rome and the Latins against other peoples, Alscans mainly, from the southeast, right, that were threatening Latium, and that required, as we've seen, also an important degree of garrisoning, of fortification, of defense of such frontier, which was a quite dynamic thing too, because of course this is also how the Romans began to, and the Latins began to launch raids beyond Latium, and realized that essentially this quite rich and populated province had the manpower, the resources to really expand further beyond itself, requiring an organization that had to be ever more hierarchical in these wars. As you understand, there is also the same victory of Rome over the Latins, right? So it's gradually the moment of a definition of a heavy hierarchical system, as far as the unchallenged and unchallengeable superiority of Rome was concerned over eventually what would still essentially remain a confederacy, but de facto commanded by Rome. Now, we don't know really much about the Latin colonization at this time, right? I say Latin including Rome at this point because, as you know, later on there was the difference between the Roman colonies and Latin colonies. Importantly enough, the first ones provided essentially with a strategic purpose, really literally military colonization and frontier. The Latin ones being essentially a bit gentrified, more economic oriented, and at times even some Roman citizens would prefer to actually abandon their own full Roman citizenship to actually become Latins, because that would be easier sometimes, not always. There were more prerogatives the other way around, but still, it began at this time. Also, we can't quite districate really. We don't know even the ratio between Rome and the Latins regarding this older colonization, right? Livy speaks of Roman establishments established, in fact, by Rome, or by Rome jointly with her Latin allies, right? And there are some, of course, varieties too in the nature of these colonies, because some were short-lived, and Livy is aware of that, and that makes his account also more relatable, because again, we're talking about very archaic, primitive times, right? As actual military avamposts. The problem was finding the resources to maintain troops there, right? We're not talking about huge distances either, but for these tribal systems, it was a huge deal, right, to begin with. There was an evident strategic function that entailed, of course, this primary need to defend from external enemies, to also be able to launch from their offensives in their territories. And surely there was some competition internally, because guaranteeing, manpower there, and so also making these settlements becoming, on the long run, a source of reliable manpower themselves was a huge deal, depending on who would control them and how. And this is also why the wars between Rome and the Latin League were fought in the first place. Which are there towns dating from that time that we think were founded as colonies? Sure. There is Norba, founded according to tradition 492, Setia, today's Setse, around 382. And if you look at their location, they are both situated on the edge of the Lepinian Mountains that were essentially the bastions against the Volsci at Antium on the coast, and essentially the Pomptine Plain, which is the direction, again, that would be taken by the Roman-Latin confederacy for further expansion. We don't know of colonization from 380 and 340, roughly in this. Probably reflects the problem that Rome and the Latins were having at the time. So less amicable relations and essentially a political failure in agreeing regarding these deductions. Yet after her final settlement of Latium in 338, so when the Latins, in other words, were gotten rid of, or at least now basically subjected to Rome, Rome in fact revived the concept of the Latin colony herself, right? And this would have a major importance because that the Samnitic Wars had already began, and in order to fight on such a much more faraway place and such an inhospitable one, this terrible mountain ground populated by warlike tribes, etc., would carry out guerrilla, attritionally, and so requiring Rome and her allies to field ever greater amount of men. Were really indispensable because the conquered places had to be occupied, and you had, at that point, as we've seen, Rome was very, very powerful at this point already, and she had become basically a steamroller, so much that she could force some peoples to properly colonize there, some allies, and to occasionally also deport or massacre whatever those who fundamentally were keeping to exist against her. We will look at these aspects later, right? The Samnitic Wars, as we've seen, were essentially the only time, say the last useful time which Roman expansion in Italy could be thwarted, at least until the Battle of Saguntum. But that the main problem had been the Samnites as such, and that were also the only people that in Italy among all the others from the north, from the Celts to the Greeks, let's say, in the south, were actually considering as not really a peer, because Rome really believed of herself like to be destined to take over the world in inside, but definitely the ones that the Romans recognized the value of, militarily speaking, and the Samnites had proven to be a quite courageous confederacy to break, and this Oscan people, as you know, would always remain quite hostile to Rome, like by other Italics basically saying, we are fairly akin, after all. Rome gives us opportunity, as far as at least as the elites, to participate into it, to gain more resources to distribute in the communities, and kind of progressing this thing. The Samnites, until the 1st century BC, still believed that there could be something like a rise against Rome to break, right? This thing essentially was not to happen. And after the Second Punic War, for them, so at that point, any Roman shortcoming was simply a matter of will, as always, politically, and the rest was just at best a fight within the same Roman system, including the social wars, as a matter of fact. Now, the strength of this new series of colonies in fact stretch from this time, right? 16 founded between 334 and 263 BC, right? Lay above all in their strategic locations, right? And since we will see now that this colonization now, from a bit of a different perspective than the same military one, it's important to remember again what the primary function, of course, of these colonies really were, and especially the Roman ones, as I was saying before, right? The 6 or 7 citizen colonies founded on the coastal sites with 300 settlers only are also an interesting feature of this, right? There is all a dimension of piracy, maritime interest. You know that Romans, until the Punic Wars, they were really landlubbers. They didn't care very much. They attempted an expedition in Sardinia at the point, but it was important first and foremost to control the ports, right? And so even this military presence just at the on the coastline, at the river mouth, at the port, whatever towns were already mostly there, also from much older time. by the way, was really crucial. And again, I will probably make a video on that topic alone because it deserves just consideration for itself. And again, to remember what was the function of the colony per se. As I understand, colonization entailed the settlements of lots of people that therefore had to be brought from somewhere to the place where the colony was found, and just to remain there, to dwell there, to live, to defend, but also to prosper, right? Reason for which the Roman citizens that were, provided with this colonies really were exempted from military service, in as much as living there counted as one in the first place. So they really counted on them. And also regarding these colonies, consider that there was a very feudal clanic mentality behind their monopolization in a sense, right? It was never like a sort of abstract government saying, okay, let's pick a bunch of people and send them there. There was always an interest behind that from some powerful oligarchs that just decided to put together their clienteles, their resources, go settle in one place that they knew to be strategic. They knew to be, in this sense, also, strategic, not just from a military point of view, but also economically speaking. So they cared about the power they could, the leverage they could make in terms of political power, also as far as internal Roman politics was concerned, right? Which was evidently greater just than the one of the Latins that were left instead a little bit aside in the process. So again, always remember, the Romans were superior to everyone because the civitas optimo iure was the equivalent to, like, you are a true freeman. You're somebody that can bear arms just in face of God, right? And that is the greatest thing ever throughout all history. And surely a big deal in a moment in which Rome, as we've seen, was essentially systematically and non-stop subjugating a shocking amount of people and resources, right? And succeeding, to say the least, in doing that and in securing a courageous confederacy that wouldn't break even after the massacre of Cannae was something so well planned, so well thought out, so convenient for really those who held the decisive moral majority of the system that the Roman Empire was born out of that. Just saying. So we don't know much about 4th century BC Roman economics to say, okay, well, we can understand all the implications of these colonies. What we see, though, is that there was here a conservative, let's say, and liberal thought, whereby it was actually the people that wanted these colonies to be deducted for the obvious reason that, the masses wanted land, wanted power, and the conservative elite didn't want to give them, right? You understand the concept here of manpower here. If you literally settle some freemen / warriors in a place that is also it's technically meant to be a copy of Rome, as it would beautifully be outlined in the urbanism during in the Roman Empire, just copies of Rome in miniature in a way. But at that time, it really counted on the sense of, for example, of tribal cohesion, because, as you know, the Romans were divided in tribes, and others were created exactly to parcel this wide amount of land that they were conquering from other people. And it's a bit like the same concept of, I don't know, Fabius Maximus and Cornelius Scipio during the Second Punic War, right? The more agriculturally oriented, conservative Roman patrician landowners wanted just to remain in Italy, and they didn't want to step abroad. Instead, the most Hellenistic entrepreneurial mind that even the same patricians like Scipio could be understood that opening Mediterranean, conquering other land could create an unprecedented amount of wealth and power that surely would have represented a challenge now to be controlled, so other estates could rise over others and so on. It was a very complex issue, as you know, but it could dictate the same Roman politics. And what we realize is that the entire struggle between the patricians and the plebeians in these very years, that we may remember just from a civilian in nature, as the boring page in Roman history manuals, like it says, there was this law, the plebeians and the patricians were fighting because kind of whatever, and it was basically all about colonization, right? It was about who would get the land, and in this sense occupy it, because there was not really at the time any other way to control it in the first place. So this is what engineered the same Romano-Italic backbone over the centuries, because it was really an incredibly thick form of land occupation, control, exploitation that couldn't leave really ambiguities regarding who was in charge there, right? Let's say our sources, as we were seeing, is relatively meager, but what we understand is that colonization was connected with this great hunger for land that was corresponding also to an internal mechanism that had, up to that point, occurred. That is not just that the people wanted the land of the enemies that were fighting for, but at home there had been lots of people that had already, so Romans, right, that had grown impoverished because of the historical hegemony that the patricians had enjoyed over their, most of Roman land historically, right? So it's much less, unbalanced than what you normally know from later Roman history, but still it was cause of great concern, because you realize that well before the crisis of recruitment in the 2nd century BC and Marius' pay of the soldiers, etc., the same problems were there, right? Notoriously enough, Marius didn't invent practically anything, right? Everything was present since centuries. Roman soldiers were literally paid. That's why we're called milites in the first place, since the siege of Veii. Historically, they already received essentially their own equipment from the state in a way or another. Just the means were less centralized, but the thing was just already and obviously there. And the same problem of who gets the land in this incredibly fast, aggressive, and successful expansion and conquest, when in fact already the most powerful people that have led the others to this conquest are just more powerful and that can't manage the system themselves. But during the expansion, you need, again, plebeian manpower. And so that's where the clash really begins, because the plebeians really want representation, want something more. They want the imperium in their magistracies. They want to participate in the political process that defines how the land is distributed. Again, it's not a social, it's not a classistic explanation, right? There weren't classes entirely in the sense we intend, at least in a stereotypically cultural way. There were classes based on wealth, and there could be people, in fact, from many different backgrounds could be wealthy enough to be there, right? And this was a moment in which essentially the Roman aristocracy was virtuously successful in making things work, but not without many conflicts and problems and attrition. And the theme recurs over and over again, right? In the period after the Gallic sack, we meet it first in the story of the attempted coup d'etat of Malus Capitolinus in 385-84. So we are, again, in one of the most crucial, we're in Camillian times, right? So in those moments in which we think, probably, in fact, between the Battle of the Alia River and the Samnitic Wars, that properly what we think that we call the Serbian army was actually created in the sense of actual classes, of properly a a manipular legion that included the majority of Roman citizens, regardless their nobility, and that would start counting as, in fact, freemen as such. So Malus Capitolinus was a patrician who, however, didn't feel recognized enough. We've seen the example of Coriolanus. Similarly, Malus is being called like this because he was the one who allegedly saved eventually Rome from the citadel of the capital from the Gallic storming. So people think that the nickname Capitolinus was provided by later historiography. This is not important, right? To stress exactly the importance of this guy in terms of the fact that he was a Roman hero and that most of Roman history revolved around these dramatic clashes between patricians and plebeians. But in a sense of a virtuous unity of Roman politics, things were surely brutal in many ways. And the story of Malus there is also connected with the help that he gave to the impoverished, right? The fact that turning away from the patrician faction, he began to push for legislation for the reduction of debt penalties that were particularly heavy at the time. Again, we're talking about 4th century BC Rome. I mean, just think about the institution of the pater familias, the right of life and death, not just on family members, but in fact all those who owed these meant something to the point of having lost their own freedom. This was the case for people who got indebted, who were not able to pay their creditors, right? So the idea here behind the game was that the conservatives would try to reduce the possibility of people having a chance for improving their own wealth by actually virtuously participating to the army and conquering and killing others and grabbing their land, right, of all these enemies that were actively threatening Rome. And this kind of, not necessarily what we call, I'm talking about conservatives, liberals, but you understand here what I mean. Even some of the fiercest and patricians that, of course, believed the people to be just lesser people, because that's literally what the entire concept behind this archaic mentality really is, aside from the later embellishments, would, however, understand, just like Scipio during the Second Punic War, that the only way to make things work was actually to let God give Rome her due, and world domination through, as it's in the full wake of traditional doctrine, unleashing the forces of hell, the plebs, the vulgus, the chthonic forces, but being, as, let's say, rich in attributes as an elite, to have the strength to keep them under and to guiding them to victory and transfiguring them divinely in the process. This is the Evangelion that Rome gave to the world to this very day. And this thing naturally succeeded. And again, it's brutally fascinating how the late Republican historiography was essentially aware, but how, in the first place, of how properly Roman memory had cemented around the fact that conflict is conflict, and that doesn't stem from being either too harsh or too lenient. It stems from something that an opportunity to make better in this struggle and to push the thing forward, as it had happened for Rome. And really, and this theme recurs over and over again. It's one of the, if not probably the highest civilizational one in all human history. Under 380 BC, we are told that the plebs complained specifically that the election of censors had not been allowed, lest the true extent of debt should be known. Right? Then for 378, Livy, here the source is always Livy, by the way, we're talking about the 6th book of his histories, states that censors were indeed elected, right? But that enemy action prevented them from examining the problem of debt, right? And that the building of the city wall plunged the plebeians still further into debt, right? So you realize what is happening. It's a defensivistic mentality. let's just involve in ourselves. Let's just isolate. Let's just become paranoid. Let's just convince the people actually that making war is bad because you become poorer, right? And what is actually happening by this mindset is not making your power boom and taking over other people because you're better than them. Only if you're better than them you succeed. Otherwise you can't. This is the entire universal religion that any single people at the time believed in, and it was shared universally without any exception of any kind. Right, so that all these other conquered peoples understood the thing, and that's where Rome stepped in also by saying, but look, you can't be elevated by the conqueror at the same time. So you're given an opportunity, right, beyond that. And the concept of slave manumission stemmed from the same concept. Not a conservativistic, let's put it in this way, idea. I just accumulate as many slaves as I want, and I pretend the system just to hold, without liberalizing resources, giving them the possibility, the chance of the will, the motivation to work, and still, as people connected to me as freedmen, make the system expand, which I can have some greater power later on. No, just this paranoid, isolationistic mentality that, again, here we don't have to think to be fully embraced by either bloc. It's just like today. Definitely isolationism is one of the greatest symptoms of cultural inferiority in the history of mankind, and probably manifested in a moment in which people lose moral force, right? Another thing is also wanting to expand without having the force and screwing up everything in a delusional way. That's actually the point too. But here, since we know that the thing worked and worked pretty well, what happened is crucial to process, right? In 377, there is in Libya a generalized comment on the impoverished state of the plebeians from the background to the long narrative of this very important struggle, which would end up with the Licinian-Saxtian rogations. We will see now one of the most momentous legislations in Roman history. As a matter of fact, it was the one that would finally confer the plebeians the same consulship at some point. I mean, at least part of it. We don't think even necessarily all the time one plebeian and together with one patrician in the collegial magistracy, but still the option, and this is immense. This is literally immense. In fact, these rogations would be famously passed 10 years later in 367, and according to Livy at least, these included a measure for among the other things, the elevation of debts by allowing previous payments of interest to help towards the repayment of the principal, for which 3 further years were given. So basically you would pay slightly less and you had the time of paying your creditors later on, right? And the idea again behind this is not letting people getting away with this. It was a political calculation to say, if we are able to send these guys in the army, if we manage to motivate them just for what they really want, which they wanted themselves, they wanted the land, right? This is also what a civilization has to gain from expansion, right? Again, if you prove to be strong, it's because you convinced somebody else to be weaker. And so at that point, it's right to take whatever you like until you're not stopped. And then you have to be intelligent enough to understand when that's the case. And this was equally understood, after all, by the patricians internally in relation to the same plebs, right? So, in other words, these debts would be repaid by the loot, by the conquest, by the economic reward that, again, requires a specific video that today we will not, say as a topic we will not address, but I want to make this relatively soon. So again, we don't even know exactly what happened with the Licinian-Saxtian rogations, but it's meaningful aside from the history of the magistracies of other, some kind of spaces that were given to the patricians that would be taken away from the consulship. And there is this thing of the debts that, for Livy, importantly enough, were worth of mention, because there had evidently been a debate connected with the same imperial potestas that could not be just randomly there in the package without any sense, So measures to curb indebtedness also do not stop in the Livian narrative. For example, in the 7th book, they're really prominent, and they keep showing the relevance of the issue as much as Rome kept expanding during these years. In 357, a law was passed on unciarium finus, which is essentially what we could interpret as a limited interest rate to 100% a year. So this is for generic debts, but obviously in a word like that, it meant who had how much land concretely, right? In 354, or who could dispose of that, because again, there are as you understand, cliental intersections and so on. And that's why it was important for the plebeians just to access certain magistracies in order to have even the power of, negotiating the conditions. In 354, there is yet another notice referring to the miseries of the plebs, right? In 352, we are told, this is again old Livy, from the 7th book, that a commission of 5 was appointed to settle debts with money loaned by the state. Interestingly enough, which means that, again, also the statal control on the land was increasing, and that's where you absolutely want to participate, right, in the system. And so here actually, many elements had been co-opted from the people, and there was just further negotiation on the base also of the conquest, etc. Then again, Livy comments on the financial difficulties of the plebeians and tells us that the maximum rate of interest was halved to 50%. In 344, we know that usurers were prosecuted. In 342, the leges Genuciae are said to have put a complete ban on usury. Here again, we will treat this now, but because you have to understand also the mechanism, how physically this land was occupied, which was a very thorny topic, would never be solved in Roman history. It's much to cause, at the end of the day, this system to go unbalanced with the 2nd century BC crisis of recruitment. In fact, the impoverishment of the average Roman citizen, right? The guy that in theory had, in fact, to be the backbone of the Roman military at that time, the so-called peasant soldier, right? So we mostly remember it after the Second Punic War, but it was, as you understand, a century-old issue that had to be constantly regulated, especially as long as Rome was keeping to expand and land was keeping being distributed. So the last measured one of the leges Genuciae, the ban on usury, is preceded in Livy by a long account, meaningful enough, of the mutiny in the Roman army, right, in which the soldiers complained of their impoverishment, and the fact that the land that were given were the bad ones. And another issue, consider these people at home were, generally speaking, farmers. I mean, most Romans lived in the countryside around Rome and or had possessions, etc. So they were, as we've seen at this point, were properly part of the army. They were divided in classes and all, and they complain about the fact that fundamentally there was prelection on land that disadvantaged them. Right? We'll explain again later briefly how this thing really works. This is really simple. Livy reveals, however, that some of his sources, whichever they were, recorded only a sedition at Rome herself. Right? So he was not sure about this thing of the mutiny in the army. In any case, from a political point of view, it was evident that the plebs was not so happy. Also, in fact, there was extensive plebeian unrest in the same year, certainly enough. So what we are told is that throughout this phase of major expansion, the plebeians kept asking for not essentially going under. Some people have said, but Livy is just maybe a bit dramatizing the situation. He's making his history, his narrative, his account. However, but here we are in front of pretty kind of concrete measures being described. They all make sense in that pattern. They're nuisance enough, they're differentiated enough, right? This is not just a single like theme or a single chapter or a single episode or issue. This in Livy's sources appeared evidently and was likely known at the time as having been a severe problem. And again, yes, this was happening in the 1st century BC, where things were still basically about that by some degree. Because, again, you could have a prosperous empire, you could even have some relatively prosperous middle classes, but again, the proletarians, the ones who joined the legions just because they literally didn't have anything but their children as a property, we're always doing that in the hope of being compensated. These are the same years. I don't know, Augustus had the problem of all the, settling all the veterans after the civil wars. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of, not just of men, but of actual veterans, right? So people who know how to make their voices heard. So while there is no doubt that, of course, Livy was not really knowing everything precisely from the 4th century BC how the system worked, however, we cannot deny that there must have been in Rome a flurry of legislation on debt in those very years. That are also, again, the ones in which Rome is really actually starting to create. These are the years in which the Manipular Legion is being formed, is being arranged, is being politically. There were lots of backs and forths, in which the thing was being adjusted, and Rome in all this was still, however, succeeding to expand. Right, so it's the most crucial moment. It's the one in which, of course, these people didn't want to be cut out from the decisional process. And in which, of course, the political tension arose from, after all, the plebeians had two options: or going to fight to take their land, because nobody would just give them to them for free, or just remaining home and letting essentially the more powerful to simply just control it and gradually, sclerotizing under their control. This shows also how powerful the Roman citizenry was, generally speaking, what had come to be the fact of the Roman citizenry. By this point, again, is another hugely complex issue I'm not going to discuss today. So when you look at the details, you have definitely the impression that there is a well-built narrative, that this prevalence of the debt theme, especially among the poorer plebeians in the years 389 to 367, and the further confirmation from in the following 20 years, right, are really eloquent, and they speak also of the necessity of the same patricians to put together an effective system just to go take on, like at that point Rome would, such a powerful enemy like the Samnites. and the Oscan hinterland, right? So, in other words, Rome could have not made it in central southern Italy without this the system put in place. Because again, it was a strong connection between the exercise of violence and the one of political rights, unavoidably, right? So when you read Livy, just be aware of the fact that this is pretty accurate, right? This is something that makes just a lot of sense that you can appreciate in the objectivity, if anything, because we know that all the other societies that underwent this problem, this mechanism, this passage from, again, the seasonalism to professionalism, the kind of a feudal to a statal, and a material to a professional system, like it really had the same issue of regulating mostly the control on resources, right? And how, first of all, where to find them for expanding, and secondly, how to distribute the loot. And that's the most important point, arguably, because how was the conquered land distributed to Roman citizens? Right. So the thing was very simple. Essentially, Rome would conquer a people and would confiscate part, sometimes the entirety of the land, depending on how the people had behaved fundamentally, and whatever the political and strategic interests of Rome really were, and made it her own. Right? This is a world that is exclusively based on the right of the stronger to govern on the weaker. Right? So the idea that you again have conquered that people's land is because that people was too weak to handle it, and now it's yours. Right? It is really the deepest conviction that not just the Romans, but also the peoples that she had subjected, unironically, had. This land was called Ager Publicus. So, in other words, in fact, the land of the people, the land of, at least this sense of, the land of Rome, right? That was a common, just like the res publica, so the common wealth, in a way, and therefore it had to be shared by the citizens, or at least how the thing worked. There was either an actual distribution of parts of land, which meant that the government decided who, in terms of Roman tribes, had to get what in terms of specific parts of land, and then a part of the Ager Publicus instead that was practically left just for anyone to settle freely, right? The Ager naturally remained always in the hand of Rome, and if the government wanted at that point to knock at somebody's door and say, look, this thing still belongs to me as a state, right? I can't take it back. They could do it, right? Naturally, it wouldn't happen because these were the same people who literally had settled there, right? But it's obvious that when, say, a free, say, peasant that, say, had been fighting as a princeps in the Manipular Legion against the Samnites for years, finally could retire by receiving this, at least either by plot, concession, or simply just with his own means, because at that point he had presumably, like, to be a princeps, you had a certain amount of already property on your own, so mostly other land. You are a freeman. You have control on your family, on your clients, on your slaves. So you can invest all these power to simply occupy a part of the Ager Publicus you would have chosen for yourself. Now, the problem is that who was much richer than you could simply occupy not just much larger swaths of land, and so growing ever more powerful, but at that point simply, if you lived 200 kilometers from Rome, somewhere in Umbria, like, it simply dispossess you at some point, could coerce you, could scare you, could thug and bully you and terrorize you, and simply you would have either fallen in his clientele, so you started paying a canon and you start having this negotiation, and gradually you would become a client, right? If you wonder how the great warlords of late Republic had grown, well, it had been essentially like this. It's not just about the trade and, the administration of the provinces, the imports, the slaves, spoils of war, whatever. It's also this kind of social cohesion that has been forming around the fact that the average Roman has practically impoverished, and in order to survive had placed himself under your domain, let's put it in this way, and you also would have had a duty at that point towards this person. That's why all these warlords had to settle, were asking for land, after all, right? If you look at Pompey, Caesar, Crassus, we're all looking for new land to seize, because basically they had indebted themselves for creating these armies on their own, even though, yes, the money, the equipment passed through namely a public thing, but at this point it had, as you know, been privatizing, and once the war was won, the military service was over, these people wanted land, and you had to give them somewhere, and the Senate had to approve that, so it was a complex thing, and the tensions behind the civil wars was also largely about still, pre-industrial society, who owns the land, right? And always remember this, is that, in theory, at this point in history, in the 4th century, 3rd century BC, those who participate in the army are part of as we've seen, classes of recruitment corresponding to their wealth. It's a democratic system, essentially. Initially, it was based on age, and it was essentially a mix between the two, but it would eventually go ever more towards wealth. In, let's say, in Marian times, it was just you actually fighting in order to obtain the land, which was a very different thing, right? So that tells you also about the shift of the direction, why, before they were expanding against other peoples, later they were, mostly in fighting for this very rich cake that Rome really was. And so before the civil wars re-equilibrated the thing, and Rome could expand further to the conquest of the world. Now, because there was this deep imbalance within, if that had not happened, arguably Rome would have just kept expanding. It would have not been, in fact, the 2nd century BC crisis and all this. So you see, once you enter in synchrony with, the mechanism, it's easy really to understand. So this was the main issue, that even if you could get your own piece of land, at the end of the day, there were few people that could, you could hardly defend yourself against the most powerful, right? And the means just to handle these things were pretty much mob-like, right? Like all the world was really at the time. So that, yes, you could be a Roman citizen, but there were different types, at least in practice, of Roman citizens in that regard. This is crucial, right? Also, the proletarians in Maritime were Roman citizens, and could be, for such, they had the right and the utmost privilege of being soldiers, and they would enlist like crazy, right? They wouldn't want to enlist when they literally had something to lose because they had gained, and that in theory was required to them to keep themselves by a degree, or just participating to the mechanism of going at war again. And if they were too poor, they could not even enlist in the army, right? That's why eventually what Marius does is just a political reform, essentially. All these impoverished Roman citizens flock to military service once again, and the recruitment crisis was ended once for all, but albeit with massive changes in the Roman state, as you understand. Now, between the 3rd consulship of Spurius Cassius, so we're talking about very archaic times, 486, and the distribution of land seized from Capua and the Latins in 339, a constant theme of Roman sources is plebeian demands for better access to land, and in particular for a more equitable distribution of the ager publicus. Right, and that's roughly the moment we were pointing out before, in which the rogations, specifically the Lex Licinia Sectia, which limited the holdings in the ager publicus, among the other things, enters into play, right? Because these rogations fundamentally would say that there was a roof, right, in terms of manpower and cattle that you could employ on a given land, right? This is something relatively like 100 cattle or 500 kind of smaller animals, which is naturally a lot. I mean, in the 4th century BC, who owns 100, cows is very, very rich. But it's still never as much as it would become in later Roman times. You understand, you can be a very important person, but if that's the limit, I don't know how many other cows, like an average Roman citizens would have, 5, like something. It would have been already probably a consistent amount. But so it's not a huge roof, it's not a huge dimension. This tells you how balanced, after all, up to that point, from, again, mostly a tribal background, it was enriching itself, and so that could still keep at bay the nobility. This stuff that you get also in Germanic history, like when before the Battle of Strasbourg, the German freemen would taunt the same aristocrats that had arrived on horseback, because they said they had to fight dismounted themselves, because otherwise they would have run away and left the people dying so that they could have more power at home, right? So when you look at the clashes between patricians and plebeians, it's not some kind of amorphous mob and crowd that interacts in a populistic, demagogic way. We're talking about fairly strong freemen that still have an important, in fact, control of one another, and thus also the difference between, imagine, the patricians and plebeians, the rich and the poor. It's not really so, say, neatly shaped. It has also a lot to do with, in fact, who were the patricians, which is not also just so simple to answer. Who were the plebeians, which may not even actually be that simple to answer. But surely, yes, overlap that can overlap that pattern, the stereotype, but in the ratios, but that are also a somehow cohesive group, because if it hadn't been the case, altogether would have never managed to take over an astonishing amount of people, land, resources, and maintaining it for centuries in this incredibly stable system that Rome had established. Now, it's also wrong to read, in my opinion, late Republican historiography as if it was just only about the issues of the late Republic, right? So the thing saying, okay, we're talking about the 4th century BC, but we're really appealing to whichever the readers are here, the audience is, because it rings as, let's make it ring as literally as something similar to what is happening in today's times. Of course, this happened, but the first of all, these mechanisms, as you understand, are correct. They're corroborated by the sources, by the evidence, what, generally speaking, what Rome was doing macroscopically. It still made sense in late Republican times because there were the same problems at the time, so it made all the sense possible to actually tell the story, this Roman, again, myth/history at the time. As we've seen, there is an early colonization occurring even before the forging of the Manipular Legion, or in the process of, right? Later on in the 4th century CE, in 58, for example, the establishment of the tribes Pomptina and Publilia. Right. The interesting thing of the tribes is that they were created also on a territorial base, famously enough. Right. The new this new in fact districts, let's call it this way, of Roman citizenry settled somewhere were literally expanding the Roman citizenry, the Roman state, and with this, these were people who voted, right? There were new colleges were added to the pre-existing one, right? Each tribe had some vote depending on who they were, how many there were, etc. So there was also, for example, a relevance into, given that the Roman citizens had to come back to Rome in order to vote, etc. There was a relevance in terms of who had the land closer to Rome, also in Latium, that is, very fertile, and that is just close to Rome, as opposed to somebody who got this land somewhere else, far away. So there was a sense also of the centrality of Rome that was increasing, and in a sense of the general desperation, again, for land that people just wanted to get, in spite of even still the disadvantage that existed, even just in making one very far away, but still having it. Right, so the 4th century BC is not exactly a place that, let's say, a time it would compare, particularly in terms, wealth compared to our own. So you understand that for how successful Rome could be, it's not necessarily that everybody was well off and happy with this. So there was a constant attrition, a constant competition for the small surplus that any pre-industrial society can afford, with significant limitations. And we will hopefully see all this political struggles also in a more, from a more civil, juridical background in other videos. You have before this, the colonization of Sutrium, Nepet, and Setia that we mentioned before. This would be Sutri, Nepi, and Setze. We've seen them sometimes, especially the first, in medieval history. These were Roman cities. They had, of course, there had been previous settlements on them, whatever, but the process of urbanization was significantly started in these times. These were close. These colonies were founded close to the time of the Gallic War of 390. Then we have no record of the distribution of any land to Romans, as we've seen for almost other 50 years, from 389 to 342, which were instead crucial for the same issue of land distribution itself, and with that the depth, as we've seen in Livy, which is again very fascinating, because it's as if, as we were saying before, Rome had to slow down a little in terms of thinking what to do with the internal system before launching herself to towards a larger scale conquest, right? So that's why all those references in Livy, if you look at the chronology of the conquest, there is much there as well. The same goes for the colonization. You see how everything matches. So in the following years to the aforementioned ones, then you have basically the accomplishment in the removal of the patrician monopoly on the ager publicus, right? And this thing basically ends there. You can say that Rome basically takes off to the fullest, and that even the Roman manipular legion, fundamentally as the true first legion, as we intended as essentially as a statal army, is before the after the feudal war bands, right, is actually established, and is capable of taking over all the peoples that we have seen. And in parallel, unsurprisingly, this thing was financed with, again, the loot, the lands that were seized from other peoples. And so colonization began, not just as, it had existed before in some sort of, even sometimes some colonies were founded and then abandoned, whatever. Here there is an extensive settled plan in which patricians and plebeians start effectively the Roman settlement all over central Italy, right? The beating heart of what would become the empire, as an incredibly strong, well-grounded, and distributed manpower and resources in function of military service. It's also remarkable that after 342, the sources do not refer practically anymore to depth, which is meaningful. Aside from this strange event that nobody really understands even too much, that is the third secession of the plebs in 289 BC, which is very late, but could have really been connected, in fact, well, to the kind of a moment of breathing, let's say, after such huge expansion. So, in a moment in which the rhythms of this restless rhythms of conquest, we're talking about basically being at war for 150 years straight without stops, had needed kind of a reconsideration in terms of what could happen when the system had been at this point established, with that territorial extension, with that people settlement, and so on, with a different timing that had been up to that point. This may have surely been triggered by the same reason, that is the hardships of the poor, right? We only know regarding this that the nexum, that in the Roman law was a sort of debt bondage, right? Similar to essentially the loss of freedom, right? It's sort of being a half freeman, or not a sort of serf, right? That was very heavy, and in fact on this occasion was abolished by the Lex Poetelia sometime, we don't know, at the end of the 4th century BC, either 326 or 313, which surely points to the necessity of easing properly the conditions of those who had not just been indebted, but had evidently had been kept indebting in spite of all the issues that had been great part solved at that point, right? Because there was literally corporal punishment. Was the idea that if you were indebted, you could literally give a member of your family in your stead to the other person until you had repaid this debt. So it was a very heavy thing, and basically the Lex Poetelia brought this among Roman citizens essentially just to confiscate personal wealth and not, say, humiliating the person to the point of being so directly bonded to somebody who owed them some. Naturally, it was still kind of, you could, depending on the debt or other crimes, you could end up losing your freedom. But this law was designed specifically to diminish the harshness of the nexum, this form of debt bondage. There may be some literary connection here, because Livy definitely has a great so is greatly fascinated with the Samnite Wars, right? He by this point he describes properly what is called the Livian Legion, right? It's something between the Camillian and the Plebeian one, that is basically the first manipular legion as you literally see it well outlined, right? The Communal one is the one after the Serbian, that is technically, again, the first attempt to create an actual manipular legion, then to compensate for the weaknesses of the single battle line. We'll talk about that in some other video. And then, the Plebeian one is the full geared, the full kind of fully developed kind of manipular legion as we know it, that also had throughout the Plebeian era some kind of greater, some modifications. In any case, Livy is a Roman aristocrat, and he reasons in terms more of this heroic deeds of the Roman army, and so this great moral, concepts that the Roman sagas undoubtedly exuded, right, as such. So it's not that he was particularly interested in social issues, per se. He liked definitely to write more about battles, right, that also are extremely telling from a political and anthropological point of view about properly what the deal of being a Roman was. But let's say, even though, in fact, this makes the argument for the importance of those debt issues even stronger, because it's not that Livy was a particularly socially inclined person. Like most Roman aristocrats, justly enough, didn't give a fuck about poor people. But it was important that, of course, in the Roman memory, that struggle over the issue, that after all did revolve around a degree of, if not of equality, but again a sense of cohesion, like the sense that Roman citizenry was earned in virtue of your merits, definitely, and so that being part of the Roman, at this point, like even, an Augustus cannot call himself more than a princeps, which is literally just a primus inter pares. So again, the Romans had civilized in an incredibly and brutally fast time. They were still very, very connected to that sense, kind of tribal and feudal mentality. And if from one side they naturally flattered their own oligarchic prerogatives, from the other side they also appreciated, the common, rank and file legionnaire. Just think about Caesar, that aside from his popularis, propaganda, describes pretty accurate things regarding the deeds of these men that are also pretty spot on from a military point of view, and beyond. So there is definitely a great consonance between within all the sources that we can observe. We cannot refute this position, right? Livy, even in this, found a space to give the great to Appius Claudius. He surely did highlight some economical issues, for example. So it's not to say that Livy was not an insightful historian, definitely, given that a good part of Western historiographical civilization rested on him for millennia. But we should rather observe that the problem of the debt at Rome, did diminish by a degree, right? And that this happened for the physical settlement of an enormous amount of plebeians on the conquered territory of Italy. There is literally no other explanation for this, because by the 3rd century we start being pretty aware of how the Roman state, the Roman world had been working up to that point. We would have, if there had been many major social issues, as there had been by a degree. I mean, the Punic Wars, the opening of Rome and the Mediterranean to Hellenic culture, this kind of wealth, this opening of the very, in fact, archaic and primitive Italic interland to the world that it would have taken over. We see, in fact, also a very conservative society that had been molded ferociously through these conflicts, and that had come out in that typical Roman kind of concrete, practical, conspicuous mentality that we are better acquainted with whenever the Romans really began to have a true literature on their own in the 3rd century BC, for which before we hardly have the certainty of many things. But as far as the strategic implications of all this, well, it's obvious that debts had, let's say, not been such a huge deal later as it would have been before, and that the thing could have been surpassed considering how Rome had started, literally, as a feudal, say a feudal power essentially, to I would say provincially and as we've seen, also seasonally, archaically designed to base to the type of de facto imperial land with a pretty solid ethnic core land could start basically ruling over foreign countries. With that military machined political system that Polybius describes quite accurately, at least in the impressiveness of, is definitely passing through the fact that Rome had the capacity of literally molding through this constant, relentless, steamrolling military activity that involved large masses of Roman citizens in the conquest and settlement of the Italian peninsula. Right, so Roman colonization is something that dates way before the Roman Empire, 264, at least if that's what you wanna, with the establishment of the overseas colonies. That's whatever. The Imperium had always been there in the first place. It's just the Republic never existed. The Empire, at least as we understand in this more Victorian sense, never existed. The Imperium was the thing, and man finding in recognition of their ownership of it, of their merit, of their virtue, were the ones who had literally grabbed this world and molded it in their own image, and were ready for taking the thing to a further step. Right, so it's very fascinating to dwell in a bit of this kind of mythology, because it's extremely telling, and the more you read about it, and the more everything makes sense. Because this historiography, by the way, we read it in a kind of a prosaic way, say maybe too much, but I mean strongly influenced by other literary models, other histories, mostly the Hellenic ones. But the Romans were drawing from literal sagas so something that made sense, not like a story, but like as an incredibly intertwined amount of meanings. It's full of religious stuff. It's literally something very unsecular, unmodern, and that had been stratified over time as a sort, in fact, of dictum that had to be interpreted as such, right? And that, as Dumézil, for example, did the fantastic job of interpreting whatever, etc., shows it's much more complicated than, of course, what I said today is just a very simple one. But really, read Dumézil, Camillus, for example, right? That blows your mind. In any case, we will hopefully talk about all this stuff at some other point. For today, I stop it here. I just hope that you will enjoy this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, do a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.